So let me begin by saying good morning. Good morning and welcome to the 2014 North Carolina Rural Assembly. Let me begin by saying on behalf of the Board of Directors and the staff of the Rural Center that I cannot overstate how good you look to us sitting here this morning. Give yourselves a round of applause. It's been a long time, 2 years, since the rural leadership of our state convened to learn, to share, and to celebrate. We are delighted that you are here with us today, and we hope to deliver to you a program that will be informative, thought-provoking, inspirational, and relevant to the work you do every day in your rural community or region. Yesterday, we held the annual meeting of the Board of Directors, and let me take just a moment to recognize the board of the Rural Center. Would the board please stand? Now let us turn our attention to three outstanding presenters who are going to talk to you over the next hour and a half about exactly where we find ourselves today in late October of 2014 in rural North Carolina. You will now hear from a demographer, an economist, and a subject area expert in workforce development. They will talk to you about the demographic changes happening in our great state from a rural perspective, about the economic forces at play as rural North Carolina finds its way in a globally connected and competitive world, and about the very real challenges we face from a workforce development perspective as we seek to spark the job creation engine and improve the standard of living of all of our rural citizens. I'm going to introduce each speaker now and ask that they come forward in that order to deliver their presentations. First up, and it was an honor to meet her finally and heard great things about her and her work and the work of the Carolina Population Center, is Dr. Rebecca Tippett, Director of Carolina Demography at the Carolina Population Center at UNC-Chapel Hill. Her areas of expertise include population estimates and forecasts, migration, and indicators of economic well-being. Rebecca's experience includes designing and implementing surveys for state agencies to meet federal reporting guidelines, forecasting population trends to determine the demand for new schools, and evaluating the success of different estimating methodologies for the U.S. Census Bureau. She regularly writes and presents about the impact of demographic and social trends in North Carolina. Following Rebecca will be Dr. James Kleckley, Director of East Carolina University's Bureau of Business Research and a Research Associate Professor in the Department of Finance. In addition to his day-to-day management of the Bureau, he participates in research projects, teaches an MBA economics class, and coordinates the applied research activity in the College of Business. Dr. Kleckley obtained his PhD at the University of South Carolina. He is a regional economist and has conducted local area economic analyses since the mid-1970s as both a private consultant and as a research faculty member at several universities, most of them in the South. Dr. Kleckley regularly produces economic forecasts for the nation, North Carolina, and all 100 of North Carolina's counties. He devotes most of his research efforts to assisting business and government in the use and evaluation of economic information, from the development of economic impact and development feasibility studies to lectures and training programs that help others better understand the strategic uses of economic information. Finally, we have a good friend to the center and someone we've worked with over the years. John Quinterno is a principal with South by North Strategies, a research consultancy specializing in economic and social policy. His areas of expertise include labor market analysis, data analysis, workforce development, economic development, unemployment insurance, and post-secondary education. Quinterno possesses an academic background in public affairs and extensive professional experience. Prior to founding his own firm, he worked for the nonprofit North Carolina Budget and Tax Center, where he oversaw the center's work related to unemployment, higher education, workforce development, and unemployment insurance. Earlier in his career, he worked at the University of North Carolina Program on Public Life, a research center, and the HOPE program, a job training organization in Brooklyn, New York. In 2010, Quinterno was selected as a Marshall Memorial Fellow by the German Marshall Fund of the United States. In 2013, he was named to the roster of the Fulbright Specialist Program for a 5-year term. He earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame and a master's degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, originally from Rockville Center, New York. Now living in North Carolina, John Quinterno. And it's my pleasure now to welcome Rebecca Tippett to the podium.
All right, great. Good morning, and thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. As Patrick so kindly introduced me, I'm the director of Carolina Demography, which is a fairly new research service at the Carolina Population Center at UNC-Chapel Hill. And you may not know, but the Population Center has been around for almost 50 years. It's a global leader in population research. We have over 60 faculty fellows working in 85 different countries. But until recently, we did not have a significant focus on the state. And our director decided it was very important for our center to really focus on what was going on in the state because, like the rest of the country, North Carolina is experiencing significant demographic shifts. We have growing Hispanic and Asian populations. There's the looming impacts of population aging. And as all of us in this room are well aware, we have widening disparities between urban and rural portions of the state. So today I'm going to share some of our research with you about demographic change in North Carolina with a particular focus on what's going on in rural North Carolina. As an overview of what I'm going to talk about, we're going to start with defining what we mean by rural, at least within the context of this talk. Next, I'm going to overview some recent data that Carolina Demography produced on housing units with a focus on urbanization and a look to the future. Then we're going to talk specifically about the importance of migration, because this is really key to population change in the state, and it's very important for the overall health of rural North Carolina as well. And last, we're going to just take a brief look at what these trends really mean for rural North Carolina going forward. So what do we mean by rural? Well, it really depends on who you ask, right? So we have a wide array of definitions that can be administrative, land use based, or economic based. And depending on the definition that's employed, anywhere from 17% to 50% of the United States population is classified as rural. Today, did this go? All right, so I'm going to be using the Rural Centers definition, which is 85 rural counties. These include 80 counties that have 250 or fewer people per square mile, and another 5 so-called transitional counties that have more than 250 residents per square mile, but retain significant rural characteristics. So Union County is one of those, where the western portion bordering Mecklenburg is highly developed, but the eastern portion is very different. Of course, as anybody who has lived, worked, or traveled throughout the state knows, there's a lot of diversity within these counties. And although we could break them down in a lot of different ways, one key distinction that I want to make, because it's very critical for overall demographic change and economic development, is whether or not these counties are located within a metropolitan region, meaning that their commuting patterns are tied to an urban core. And among these 85 counties, 31 are in metropolitan regions. Taken together, these counties have 85% of the state's land, but only 50% of the population. And when you look at the non-metropolitan counties, that ratio is even higher. There's much more land than there are people. So we're going to look now at a little bit about what's going on in the land. So even though, as I said here, they have 50% of the state's population, one thing that we know going forward is that share of state's population is only going to continue to decline. And we can get a sense about why that is by looking at trends in housing units and development. So I'm about to share with you some data that Carolina Demography produced and released last fall, What we did was we used the 2010 census data and the most recent American Community Survey to produce historic estimates of housing unit construction from 1940 through 2010, and then project those forward to 2050. So we produced these at the smallest geographic level possible, the block group, and we made estimates available for every decade from 1940 through 2050 for all 6,155 block groups in the state. And the reason that we're interested in housing is that housing mirrors population growth. They don't always move in tandem. Those of you in vacation destinations know that you can have lots of housing units that don't necessarily translate into permanent residence. But they do give a really clear impact of the ways in which population growth can impact the land and the potential infrastructure needs that come with population growth. So this map is housing unit density in 1940. The yellow areas are lower density rural areas, the green with 50 or fewer housing units per square mile. The green areas are moderate density suburban areas, and the blue areas are higher density urban areas. As a point of reference, here are some of the major urban areas at this time. And you can see one of the key things here is just how rural the state is in 1940. That you can see that there are some pockets of high density, but the triad of Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and High Point is higher density than the triangle. This is pre-RTP. And the really high densities in Hickory and High Point reflect the booming furniture businesses that were in those regions at the time. Now, as we move forward, I want you to keep in mind the layout of the present-day interstates, because population tends to grow around transportation corridors, as you'll see quite clearly. In 1950, the general pattern persists with a little bit of intensification of density around the transportation corridors and in the major urban areas. And similar patterns continue in 1960. Now, 1970 is the first year we start to see a little bit of suburban growth. This is where people are beginning to move out of central cities and into suburban areas. And the combination of continued outmigration from central cities plus population growth only intensifies these trends in 1980, as well as 1990. So similar patterns continue in 2000. And this is actually a really key point in the state's rural to urban transition, depending on how you're measuring rural. Again, at this point, this is the first time in the state's history that the majority of the state population is living in an incorporated area. These trends continue in 2010, and now I think about 55% to 60% of the state's population are living in incorporated municipalities. Now, if these trends continue, this is what the state might look like in 2050. And you can see quite clearly the emergence of what we would call a megalopolis, a Charlotte Triad Triangle megalopolis, this highly urbanized corridor snaking throughout the state. I think one of the questions that happens is, what does this mean for rural, right? Does this mean inevitable population decline in rural North Carolina? No, not at all. In fact, even though some rural counties are projected to lose population due to the impact of population aging, overall, rural North Carolina is projected to continue to grow through the coming decades. But compared to urban North Carolina, they're growing much less quickly. So consequently, the share of population is going to decline, even though the overall population is increasing. I also do want to revisit, if you look quite clearly, there's an increase in housing unit density projected in certain parts of rural North Carolina, the western portions of the state and the eastern portions on the coast. Other portions of the state, like kind of traditionally eastern North Carolina, are not projected to see the same amount of increase. So one thing I want you to keep in mind, as I know you're likely well aware, that the experience of rural is in no way the same across the state. We're going to focus on that again and again. So underlying these numbers and these projections are two main processes. We can call them life's arrivals and departures. So you're here, or you leave here for one of, and you leave here for one of two reasons. So you're here because you're born here or you moved here, and you leave because you die or move away. So that's it. That's my job, right? That's what I study. But it's really how these things break down by age and sex, race and ethnicity, education and income, that start to tell us a really rich and robust picture about what's going on in a place and what might happen in the future. So the balance of these processes also tell us about what's currently existing in a place. So natural increase, more births than deaths, or natural decrease, more deaths than births, tell us something about the age structure of a population. So relatively young populations tend to have more births than deaths. And often counties with young populations or regions with younger populations will have population growth even if nobody's moving into that population, just because of those natural processes. On the other extreme, relatively older populations typically have more deaths than births. And often the consequences of population aging will lead to population losses or stagnation unless it's counterbalanced with migration into the place. Net migration reflects the relative appeal of a location. So economically vibrant or kind of high quality of life areas tend to pull people into them compared to other areas, whereas places that have suffered natural disasters or economic losses and job loss tend to lose population due to migration. At the national level, we've had two great examples of this in the past 10 years. New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina and Detroit following the Great Recession are examples of how net migration reflects on the ground conditions. So this is going to show you the last 30 years of these components in North Carolina. So again, this is the state as a whole. And this gold line represents natural increase. So this is births minus deaths. And at no point since 1980 has a state had, anything but growth due to more births than deaths. You can see that it spiked somewhat in the mid-2000s and then declined more substantially. And this is actually due to the combination of two factors. One, the recession hit. People who may have wanted to have children stopped having children so much because they're expensive, and they're waiting for things to get back on track. At the same time, we're seeing kind of the increasing impact of population aging. So at the same time that births are declining due to economic conditions, we have more people who are older, and unfortunately that often leads to more deaths. So those two factors work together to decrease the impact of natural increase on population growth for the past six or 7 years. This blue line represents net migration into the state over the same time period. So net migration is very responsive to economic conditions, and you can see it dropped substantially in the early 2000s following the recession at that time period, and again following the Great Recession. But at no point has net migration into the state been lower than natural increase since 1990. This is not all states look like this. Some states look very different, but about 2/3 of North Carolina's population growth since 1990 has been due to net migration into the state. In fact, we've added about 1 million net migrants each decade since 1990 for a total of 2.2 million new individuals from migration in the past 23 years. And when you look at the net migration between 1990 and 2010, about half of those individuals moved to one of the 15 urban counties. Another 500,000 moved to those 31 rural counties that are within metropolitan regions. But that still leaves 300,000 over 20 years that moved to those 54 rural, non-metropolitan counties. And right now, I do want to focus a little bit on why migration matters so much for these 54 rural, non-metropolitan counties. Because between 2000 and 2010, net migration accounted for 75% of population growth in those 54 counties. And it's going to be the only source of growth in the coming 10 years. According to the state demographer, those 54 counties are projected to have 20% of the state's births between now and 2020, and 28% of the state's deaths. So net migration is going to be the only source of population growth into these places. And although not every county within these 54 rural, non-metropolitan counties is going to grow between now and 2020, net migration is going to keep a lot of them from shrinking or declining, and it may mitigate some of the population losses from population aging in some of the counties. So what I'm going to focus on, and when we think about migration, each county and state has its own kind of unique migration profile that tells us a lot about why people are coming there or leaving. So before we get into some of these specifics, I want just a show of hands. How many of you have ever moved in your life? All right. I see some people not raising your hand. So, much like birth, this is we've all been born, we have all moved at some point. You are all experiencing demographic processes, right? So but although each of our individual narratives and our stories for why we've moved may be very different or very specific to us, ultimately we can break down these reasons for moving into what I'd say are 4 main categories. So one, we have you move to go to school, right? So this is why I first moved to North Carolina. 2, you might move to get a job. This is why I moved away and why I came back to this state. 3, you might not really have much of a say in the matter, right? You're a kid and your parents are moving and you're going with them whether you like it or not. Or maybe your partner is moving because of school or a job, and you really like them, so you want to stay with them, and you're moving too. And then there's this 4th category, which is a little bit of the kind of catch-all for everything else, and it's this nebulous quality of life, right? The housing's better. The schools are better. Your commute to work maybe is better. Or you like the weather, or you're trading off on some of those things for better weather. Just the amenities are nice. So those are the main reasons. And we have some data from the University of Wisconsin that actually goes back 60 years for every county in the nation and provides migration profiles by age, by race and ethnicity, and by sex. And when we look at these profiles, they can highlight a lot of why people are moving to or moving away from a place. And I'm going to focus on the last 10 years of this data, 2000 to 2010, but you should know that in many cases, these profiles are very stable over time. So this table is going to show you net migration by age between 2000 and 2010. Anything on this line means that no net migration is occurring. It does not mean that there's not migration. It just means that just as many people are moving in as are moving out from a place. So if people who are moving in look really different from the people that are leaving, you can still have very significant population composition changes, even if total population remains the same. Anything in this area means net out-migration. More people are leaving than are moving in. And anything in this area is net in-migration. More people are moving in than are moving out. So this data is going to be for the state as a whole at first. And this is net migration into North Carolina over the past decade. You see that it's positive at all ages, with a really significant spike between the ages of 15 and 29, representing individuals who are moving here to go to school, to start a job, or because they're employed at one of the many military bases throughout the state. The plateau between the ages of 30 and 54 really highlights the fact that North Carolina remains a major destination for people across their working careers. We have lots of employers who bring people here at all points in their careers. And the spike at older ages of 55 and older is fairly new for the state. But North Carolina has really emerged as a retiree destination in the past 10 or 20 years. And with the retiring of the baby boomers, I think we can only anticipate that that will increase in the next 10 or 20 years. This yellow line is for the is net migration into the 15 urban counties. This brown line is into those 31 rural metropolitan counties. And this green line is overall net migration into the rural non-metropolitan counties. So as you can see, the urban one tracks the overall state very closely until about age 30 or 35. And then migration into the urban areas falls substantially. The rural metropolitan and the rural non-metro county overall net migration is, with one exception, positive at all ages, just much lower. But there's 2 key things I want to highlight here that I think are the really interesting points of difference. And one is that among those 54 rural non-metropolitan counties, the only time it goes negative is in the ages of 25 to 29. At the same time, that's when the urban counties spikes. So what's going on here? Most likely it's individuals moving away for better educational and employment opportunities elsewhere. At the same time, at older ages, you see a crossover between the urban and the rural counties. So what's happening here? Individuals who maybe moved away for educational employment opportunities when they were younger are moving back now that they're older or retired. And that even though older individuals are less likely to move than younger individuals, when they do move, they're more likely to choose small town or rural destinations. So it's important to keep in mind, though, that this, again, is the aggregate. This is the big picture view of the 54 or the 31 or the 15 counties. There's lots of differences within these big categories. So now we're going to put your knowledge of rural North Carolina to the test just a little bit and look at some of these specific profiles. So this is actually the most common migration profile in the state. This is a classic profile of youth drain. We see a large out-migration of young individuals that spikes at kind of post-high school ages, so people leaving for educational and employment opportunities elsewhere. You do see a little bit of positive net migration at older ages, but whether that's from return migration or just retirees is hard to tell. But it's not significant enough to counterbalance that large flow out in the younger ages. Any guesses as to which county this is? Come on. It's a good guess, but this is actually Halifax. So this is, what does this mean for planning and policy, right? It means that you have probably, often when people are moving away at young ages, the people left behind may be those who are lower health or lower wealth. And at the same time that the people who would be paying into your tax base are leaving. So you have an increased demand for social services at the same time that you have fewer resources to meet those demands. Of course, this is not just because this is the most common profile in the state does not mean it is the only profile among rural counties. And many of those youth may be headed here to one of the college towns throughout the state. And there are multiple rural counties with this profile. But this is a classic college town profile. You see the large in-migration between the ages of 15 and 24, and an almost equally large out-migration between the ages of 25 and 34, with overall net migration at other ages being fairly flat. Any guesses as to which county or school this is? Yeah, you guys know. So this is Watauga. So Pitt County and I think Jackson County also look quite similar in terms of age migration profile. What does this mean? So you have a large, highly transient population that's probably looking to rent. They probably need certain infrastructure demands like bike lanes, bus lines. At the same time, as somebody's pointed out, increased demand for bars, which may come with increased need for police force. So, their needs are a little bit different. There are two other migration profiles that look very similar to this, but reflect very different underlying needs. One would be military bases, military outposts, and the other is a prison community. So Avery County actually is the only county in the state that is whose migration profile is strongly influenced by the presence of a prison. But obviously college towns, military bases, and prison communities, radically different underlying reasons for why people are going there, and also very, very different needs. So most of the time when people leave these college towns, they're headed to one of the major employment centers in the state, such as Wake or Mecklenburg, but often people find that after they've been there for a few years, their situation has changed, they're no longer single, they're married, they have some kids, and they're looking for more space, that's still proximate to work. And they move to one of these counties. This is a very common profile among rural counties that are bordering an urban like one of the counties in the urban core, like Mecklenburg or Wake. But this is a classic family suburbs profile, right? Where you see the high spike in the ages of 0 to 14, who are coming in with their parents who are the 30 to 44-year-olds. Any guesses to which county this is? So I think I heard somebody say Union, but Johnston outside of Wake and the counties in northeastern North Carolina, south of Virginia Beach also look very similar to this. So, what does this mean? Housing costs and size, school quality is very important, as is transportation, because they're likely continuing to commute back into that urban core where their initial job may be and the reason why they came to that urban county to begin with. Another common thing that we see is retiree migration. As I mentioned, even though older individuals are less likely to move, then when they do move, they're more likely to choose rural or small town destinations. And this is kind of a classic retiree haven where you see a large spike in individuals at older ages. It also may be influenced by some return migration. Any guesses to which county this might be? So there are a lot throughout the state, and I'm hearing that reflected. So this is actually Cherokee County, in the far western corner of the state. And this is something that we're seeing really bubble up in terms of second home development in the western portion of the state. I've seen a lot of that in the data, at least. But what do we know about people who can move when they retire? They tend to be healthier and wealthier than people, so the population might be getting older, but the reason it's getting older is very different than those youth drain counties where it's getting older because all the young people are leaving. This is fairly wealthy, affluent people who are moving to the place, often bringing with them their lifetime accumulated savings. So they may be looking for more kind of entertainment options. They may put less demands on healthcare. So those are very different demands that emerge. Of course, looking at this just by age can mask some very different population trends by race and ethnicity. So I want to focus just very quickly on one more county type. And when you look at this at first, it looks a lot like kind of a combination of a youth drain, retiree, maybe some return migration going on. But this is a very kind of typical rural county profile. But when you look at it by race and ethnicity, something very different emerges. So this gold line is for non-Hispanic whites, and this red line is for non-Hispanic blacks. They overall mirror the population migration profile of the county as a whole. This blue line, though, is for Hispanics, which is incredibly high in migration that essentially stops cold at age 25. Any guesses as to which county this is? I heard it. So this is Sampson County. And what you're seeing here is, so Sampson between 2000 and 2010, their population grew by 3,300 people. The Hispanic population grew by 4,000 people the same time period, while the white population declined by about 1,000, and the black population declined by about 400. So what you see is you're seeing massive population composition shifts. In 1990, Sampson's population was 2% Hispanic. In 2010, it was 17% Hispanic. So this creates significant needs for things like ESL, bilingual service providers. Almost all these migrants are under 25. What does that mean? That means babies, right? So you have this very different demand for health care. And Sampson, much like other counties look a lot like Sampson, are Duplin, Lee, Montgomery, and Greene. So overall, what does this mean? I hope that I've been able to show you kind of migration is very important for overall the state's population growth and change, and I hope that I've been able to impress upon you how critical it is for rural North Carolina as well. And in some cases, the questions raised are questions of population growth and change, and who is coming to our communities and how are they different than those that are leaving or staying. And in others, it's one of potential population loss and decline. So who is leaving and who is left behind. And in many ways, the experience of rural is very different, as I think I've been able to highlight. And I hope that you can keep that in mind as you have some of your conversations later today. But I encourage you to ask me any questions, and I look forward to speaking with you later. Thank you.
Good morning. Hello from those of us in eastern North Carolina, where we know a little bit about rural. What I want to do is put things into context. I think when we talk about growth and development and changes in a county in North Carolina or North Carolina as a whole, you really need to keep it in the context of what's going on nationally. Most of the growth that we see in North Carolina, particularly over the last few years, is a result of what's going on in the nation. We can certainly bring more businesses in to change things, but by and large, the health of North Carolina, and in my mind, the biggest economic factor that helps North Carolina grow, or as we know, contract at times, is the health of the national economy. So what I'm going to talk about today is we're going to talk a little bit about the national economy, then we'll talk about North Carolina and how it relates to the nation, And then we're going to look at different parts of North Carolina. We're going to look at the rural areas. We're going to look at the urban areas. We're going to look east, west, and central. Then we're going to walk in terms of what's happening tomorrow, next year, 2 years from now, about what we see in terms of the outlook for the nation, for the state, and for the local areas. And when we look at the forecast, really think of forecasts as baseline measures of management tools that help us know what's going on so that we can make policy changes to make things better. And I think if you, certainly those of us in the room that have a vast interest in the health of North Carolina, all parts of North Carolina, understand that there are things that we need to do. Hopefully this will give you a little bit of documentation about the things that we see. And where Becky talked about the population, most of my focus is going to be on the employment and labor force. But we start with the measure of growth and development in the nation, and this is the gross national product. And this is the general measure that we do to look at the health of the national economy. And if you look at what's going on, in fact, the third quarter number came out today at 3.5% on a quarterly basis. That is down from the second quarter of about 4.5%, but we saw a drop in the first quarter, which really had to do with the weather that we saw throughout the nation. The blue line there is the quarter-to-quarter change, and the red line is the year-to-year change. The year-to-year really is fairly consistent, and that's the number that I spend the most time looking at. That we see a lot of noise in data, whether you look at it monthly, quarterly. But if you look at things over a longer period of time, you really do see more of I guess, the smoother growth and to me, a better picture of what's going on. Since the Great Recession, GDP has grown about 2.2%. Prior to the Great Recession and coming out of the recession in 2000, 2001, between those two recessions, we grew about 2.6%. If you look back during the 90s and much of the 80s, both those periods were periods of growth that were faster than what we're seeing today. So overall, when you look at GDP, this is how much we produce as an economy. We're growing relatively slower than we grew in the first part of the 2000s. But when you look at, in the next one, is consumption, 70% of the gross national product is you and me and what we buy, the purchase as consumers. If you notice that there's a big difference between what went on before the recession and what we're seeing now. Before the recession, it was about 2.9% growth rate since 2000. After this recession, it's only about 2.1%. So by and large, most of the slowdown that we've seen in the GDP really has to do with you and me not spending as much. But we're not borrowing as much either. And if you think of what we went through with the bubble bursting in housing, a lot of people shouldn't have been in houses in the first place. We spent a lot of money on credit cards. We're not doing that now. The credit is going up a little bit, but by and large, this spending is smoother. It's, I think, more sustainable. The new number that came out for the third quarter of this year is 1.8% growth in consumption. So in a lot of ways, where consumption now is lower than it's been in the past, but I think it's a more affordable consumption than we've seen through the last few years. In terms of working, if you look at the unemployment rate in the nation has been going down since the peak during the recession. But there are a couple things about this too, that if you look at the peak in this last recession, it wasn't as high as the peak that we saw in the previous recession back in the early 80s. But the decline in the unemployment, what we're seeing now, is much more gradual. So again, if you look at these peaks in the past, we tended to go up quickly, we tended to fall quickly. That's not happening now. And one of the main reasons that that's not happening now is technology. When people lose their jobs, oftentimes there's not a job for them when they come back. That we've been able to bring productivity into manufacturing, productivity into the office, certainly as a university where every department used to have a secretary. In our college, we have a small pool of secretaries for everybody in the college. A lot of that has to do with technology. So the unemployment rate is falling. It's now under 6% now, and hopefully we'll keep that going on. In terms of establishment employment, again, we looked at GDP before, how much we produced. Now we're looking at employment. The September number was the 48th straight month of employment increases. Not dramatic employment increases, but employment increases. So for 4 years, we've been growing as in a pretty consistent manner, little ups, little downs. In 2013, we grew just under 200,000 jobs a month. In 2014, we're growing about 225,000 jobs a month. In fact, in the last 6 months, we've grown at nearly 250,000 jobs. So this is one of the things that as economists have tried to look at a lot of different things. The economy really is improving. It's not improving as quickly as we would like. Not everybody's back to work, but it is improving. If you think back to the GDP growth that we saw, where we were faster in the early part of the decade or the early part of 2000s, in terms of employment growth, on average, between the recessions, we grew about 100,000 jobs a month. Since then, we're growing about 170,000 jobs a month. So we're really growing faster than we were before the recession, but we lost a lot of jobs during that recession, and we'd like for those jobs to come back for the people that want them. In terms of the United States, too, the character of the jobs is changing. Here you're looking at the employment change between January 2008, which was the beginning of the recession, and September 2014. 7 categories or 7 industries added jobs, from mining to leisure and hospitality, healthcare, education, the things that we think about and want to put our graduates in. Where we lost jobs were down at the bottom, manufacturing and construction. Certainly the construction was from the bubble, the housing bubble. Manufacturing is a trend that's been going on for a number of years. And one of the things that's very different about this recession and this recovery is the government jobs are down. Typically, when you would think of a recession, you go into a recession that the government would provide a safety net. That didn't happen this time. So, in fact, if government jobs held steady, the unemployment rate would be not quite 0.5% lower. But that's the changing character of the economy, and there are a lot of reasons for that, and certainly reasons that we understand. If you look at this change in employment and compare to North Carolina, you notice a couple particular items in this graph that North Carolina is the red line, the United States is the blue line. In the past, and this goes back to 1990, when the nation was growing, North Carolina was growing more quickly. But when we went into a recession, North Carolina tended to be hit harder. So we had the swings in whatever direction. Certainly a period in the 90s where we grew much more rapidly than the nation. And we saw that also emerge after the recession in 2000. But that's not happening now. And coming out of this recession, we're really growing more at the national average than the prior North Carolina average that we have been used to. Part of this now is that the character of the North Carolina economy really reflects more of what we see in the nation. If you look at the industry mix, we're much more aligned to the national economy now than we were prior. North Carolina, the same kind of changes, basically the same industries with the exception of really mining in terms of going up, but much more variable in the areas that added jobs. That huge line there is professional and business services, and one component of that would be the employment services, so the temporary services. So whether or not these are permanent jobs or not, I can't tell you today, but it's certainly something that's concerning, because we know as we were coming out of the recession, it was a different type of job that we were seeing nationally, more part-time, the less permanent, although that is changing to a certain degree. But North Carolina was hit hard with manufacturing. North Carolina was hit hard with construction, and those jobs just haven't come back as of yet. This is the industry mix of North Carolina, and I talked about the character of the nation. This is comparison between 1990 and 2014. 1990 in the red, we were between 25 and 30% manufacturing in 1990. In fact, that percentage went up during the 90s. Now manufacturing is about 11% of the economy. So the manufacturing jobs don't carry the weight that they once did. If you look at most of the other areas, there are increases and decreases. One of the big changes, again, is professional and business services in the middle. But that movement from manufacturing has really provided a different look to the North Carolina economy. I spoke at the Southern Textile Association a couple months ago, and sitting through their meeting, that it was pleasing to see that how optimistic they are, because the textile jobs are coming back to the States. But it's going to be a very different manufacturing facility. Where we used to have a lot of people that worked the line, now we're having a very sophisticated production facility that probably has more engineers than line workers. So textiles is coming back, but it's very different. Now, in terms of looking at the information to the workforce and labor force, I think it's important to talk about this, and I know John's going to spend more time on this when he talks, but there are lots of numbers that come out. In fact, there are 4 workforce numbers that I use. There's a monthly number, there's the quarterly census of employment and wages that come from Employment Security, which I use for the local data. It's a census number, it's not an estimate. And there's also an employment number that comes out on an annual basis from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. That's a count of people by establishment. So how many people are working at a particular industry, where that industry is located. So if you think of here in Wake County, and you look at that establishment count, it's the people working there regardless of where they live. They could live in Wake County, they could live in Johnson County, they could live in Durham County, but the job is here in Wake County. So it's very much a distinction from the labor force number. The labor force number looks at the people in the county with a job. So if you look at labor force employment, and these are the numbers that came out yesterday for the counties in North Carolina, it's the people in that county with a job regardless of where they work. So if you live in Wake County and you go to the Research Triangle in Durham County, the count is here. So the resident employment, unemployment, we get the labor force out of that, which is those two numbers added together, and from that we get the unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate is one of those numbers that is readily released. We talk about it every time it comes out, and this is the relative unemployment rate for North Carolina compared to the nation. North Carolina, again, in the red. And you can see that the unemployment rate fell dramatically last year and has started to turn up. And in my mind, this is really an estimation problem. And I say this, and I bring this up in this meeting, because the state numbers, whether it's North Carolina or Georgia or California, are estimates. The national number comes from the current population survey, and then every state is estimated. In a meeting a couple weeks ago with colleagues from all over the country, we're all having problems with this number. It was a dramatic decline that we think overstates the kind of the drop in unemployment in North Carolina, especially when you think back of what Becky talked about of a growing population. We have a workforce, which I showed you earlier, that's growing as fast as the nation, not faster, as fast as the nation, so why should the unemployment rate be going down? It really has to do with participation and, again, how they estimate it. If you had the same participation rate for the nation that you have in North Carolina, in other words, if North Carolinians went in and out of the labor force at the relative same rate that we see in other parts of the nation or the nation as a whole, our unemployment rate would be higher. Good news, it's dropping, but the expectation it is higher. So there, this suggests there are people out there that want jobs, and there are things that you and I and everybody else that cares about what's going on in North Carolina we can do. The game's not over. There's a lot more work that we need to do, but things are getting better. We're creating jobs, but we're not creating enough jobs to get everybody back to work. Remember, we're not just replacing the people that lost their job during the recession, but we have to create jobs for the people coming out of high school, for the people coming out of college, for the spouses moving to North Carolina to look for a job that their spouse already has. So we're a growing economy, and we certainly need to do a better job everywhere. In terms of the employment, this is a establishment employment index, and this is using the kind of the urban-rural definition that Becky was talking about in terms of metro-urban and non-urban, although all the rural is in one group. The top line in terms of employment growth, and this is putting everybody the same at 1990 and moving forward so we can keep it on the same page. The urban population is certainly doing better. The state average is the blue line right under the urban population. And then we get down to the rural population in the black line. And one of the interesting things about this, too, is that this isn't just a recent trend. That if you look back, the peak in employment was prior to 2000. So the growth that much of the state saw in the early part of the 2000 period was not seen everywhere. It wasn't seen in the rural areas, and a lot of that was in western North Carolina. That this has taken the state east, central, west, and basically what I did was to take the 77 and I-95. The counties in red in the middle were basically between those two. And then we have the western part and the eastern part. What's interesting about this is that although that line on the bottom, and I apologize, gold, it doesn't show up as well, but looks like the rural areas. But that's the textiles, the furniture, those jobs that just didn't come back. And in terms of the eastern part of the state is really about the state average here. It's not quite 1-to-1, but it is much, much closer to the state as a whole. If you take one region of the state, and this is kind of one of the important things to look about here too, that every region is different. This is the Research Triangle region, and I think it's 15 counties. And if you look at the little box on the upper right, you see all the spaghetti strings through there, and those are the different counties and their relative growth. And it's not just, when we think of the Research Triangle, we certainly think of growth. The green line on top is Wake County, and it's certainly grown much faster than the region as a whole, much faster than the state as a whole, but there are certainly areas within this region that could do a little better. The county on the bottom is actually only about 70% of the employment that it saw in 1990. So part of what we want to do is to figure out how to maintain that employment for the people that want to stay there. If you look at a particular county, and I gave a talk in Duplin County a couple months ago, again, every county is different. This is Duplin County compared to the state. Duplin County in red, they saw most of their growth in the 1990s and have really stayed pretty flat since then. A little bit of downturn during the recession, but not a lot. If you look at the share of employment, and that's the bar chart on the bottom, they're about 30% manufacturing. So I think it's important when you look at all these areas to recognize everybody is different. It's just like everybody in this room is different. Every county in this state is different, and I think in many ways different attention needs to be addressed. Now in terms of the forecast, quickly go through here. This is the national forecast. I'm part of a national panel that looks at this, and I'm bringing in the panel numbers just to kind of show where I am in this, because the forecasts that I use or for the counties are based on my national model. Real GDP, we think, is going to be about 2% this year. I'm the dark blue column on the right. I'm a little above the consensus forecast. When this was done, the consensus forecast is about 3% GDP growth next year. We will all start doing our forecasts again today since we got the new number. In terms of consumption, here's where I'm different. I don't think the consumer's going to go back to their old spending habits. I'm on the low side in terms of consumption. And the belief is that I don't think we're going to go in the debt that we've seen in the past. Housing starts are going to go up a little bit next year. I think we both believe that to be true. If we superimposed a housing start building permit data for North Carolina on this, it really mirrors that. We hit bottom, we came up, and we've really been kind of flat in terms of growth. One of the biggest areas of disagreement, it has to do with inflation. This is the personal consumption expenditure index, less food and energy. This is what the Federal Reserve looks at when they develop policy. You see the difference in terms of the bars, the highs and lows. Most of this has to do with what's going to happen in terms of the Federal Reserve of backing out of the quantitative easing. Are we going to have a period of inflation? or are they going to be able to control it? I'm on the side that they're going to be able to control it. But it's certainly a point of disagreement professionally. In terms of employment growth, I think you're going to see the same story. We're going to continue to grow at a modest pace, but we should continue to grow, and the unemployment rate should continue to go down. In terms of headwinds, and when you do these forecasts, again, these are kind of baseline forecasts given the factors that are going on now. Something could happen globally that could affect us. Talk about Ukraine and Russia. We haven't talked about them in a couple weeks, although the Russians are starting to do something. They were flying planes over somewhere I saw this morning. So what's going on in Hong Kong, what's going on in the Middle East, the world growth, Europe is slowing down. Okay, Europe is a trading partner, so that's going to affect us. China is slowing down, although still growing fairly rapidly given our standards. You're seeing in China now that a lot of their consumption is turning internal. And for many years we think of China as the export nation producing for everybody else. They're starting to produce for themselves now. So that'll have an impact on us. People have talked about Ebola. I don't think that's going to have an economic impact. I saw North Korea is doing something again. So these are all global things that really could affect us, particularly in the Middle East if something happens to oil prices. But we're starting to insulate ourselves from that now with more of a robust domestic production of gas. So domestically, the monetary policy, we ended tapering yesterday. It wasn't a unanimous decision by the Fed, but I think most people agree that that's going to be the case. Now you're going to start hearing every day, when are they going to raise interest rates? Most of us think it's going to be sometime next year. It could be earlier. It could be later. They might not do it at all. And when they do it, it's going to be very small. I think you're going to see very small incremental changes, and part of that is done to really to shield any kind of drastic effects. So if they raise the federal funds rate by 25 basis points, you're going to see the stock market fall by 200 that day, and then people will come to their senses and it will go back up the next day. So we're going to see a lot of that, I think, over the next months. The biggest headwinds, I think, to domestic growth and North Carolina growth is fiscal policy nationally. The tax reform, we all say we need it. Both sides, nothing gets done. The federal budget, we have to do something to keep that deficit going down. We're going on the right path. I don't think you can do it overnight. Europe did it overnight. They went into a recession. I think it needs to be done, but I think it needs to be done in a gradual, consistent way. I think we need to invest in infrastructure. The road system, we're starting to see that in North Carolina. Working on a project looking at the US 70 bypass around Kinston. I personally think the biggest thing you could do for economic development in eastern North Carolina, northeastern North Carolina, is get the road from Raleigh to Norfolk in the ports, and you're going to open up a lot of activity for those counties. So the things can happen. But in terms of the forecast, just quickly going through this, I don't think North Carolina is going to return to its growth above what we've seen in the nation. I think North Carolina, because of the way it looks now, is going to look more like the nation in terms of growth. So if the nation grows faster, North Carolina will grow faster. The unemployment rates, regardless of which unemployment rate you look at, they're going to be going down, but they're going to be going down gradually. It would be nice if we could pick that up and make it faster, but they're certainly going in the right direction. In terms of the different parts of the state, urban and rural, in terms of employment growth, we're all growing, but you could see the the steepness of the urban growth is much more significant than what you see in the rural areas. And then down on the right-hand side, east, central, and west, one of the interesting things here is that don't think that the eastern North Carolina will grow quite as fast as the state as a whole. When you look at the unemployment rates, again, all going down to different degrees, although they're really sort of hitting there, but if you follow the black line, that's basically all the rural adjacent, rural non-adjacent to metro counties, and but everything's going down, but the rural rates are going to be much higher. This just doesn't want to work for me. Implications for North Carolina. As I said, most of the North Carolina's growth is dependent upon national growth. Growth in different counties of North Carolina is dependent upon the different mix of employment. You know, you're more likely to attract a new company if you already have the labor force there, or if you can better educate the labor force that you have now. And the attraction of new industries to North Carolina is dependent upon a market basket of factors, both state and local. You know, what can we do in terms of improving education, improving the help for the entrepreneurs that we have for the small businesses. So if you look at North Carolina, again, it's a good place to live. It's a growing state, but there's certainly much, much more that we can do from this group to the elected officials to really every citizen out there. And if we start to be proactive, I think in North Carolina we've got a good, solid future. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. As Patrick said, my name is John Quinterno, and it's always delightful to have an opportunity to work with the Rural Center, and I'm very honored to be here with you, as well as to participate on a panel this morning full of folks who are very, very knowledgeable people, but also people who really want to take their knowledge and make it more practical and applied to the work of civic leaders all across the state. So that's a very sort of special group to be among, because not everyone likes to do that. Now, as Patrick said earlier, and as you probably guessed by my accent, I am not a native North Carolinian, nor am I a native Southerner, unless you count the South Shore of Long Island as being south. Maybe it floated away and came down this way. But given that defect, I guess, in my background, not being from North Carolina, I have lived here since 2000, and I've worked on public policy issues in a variety of formats. And during that time, I've seen many changes, some good, some bad, but I think no change from my perspective has been more important or consequential for communities and families across the state than the real upheaval of the state's labor market that occurred not just during the Great Recession, but even going back more to the 2001 recession. Unfortunately, I think from a labor market perspective, the past 15 or so years in North Carolina have been a very unpleasant ride for many communities, and unfortunately many of our non-metropolitan or rural communities have really borne the brunt of those changes. So my goal for today is not so much to go through the blow-by-blow and relive the events of the past 6 to 7 years since the Great Recession occurred, but what I'd like to do is lift up 4 or 5, just a few key points I think that rural civic leaders need to understand and be aware of, because for good or bad, there are things that these communities and leaders will need to grapple with going forward. Now, before I get into the substantive part of my remarks, I wanted to give a few background issues. One is when I talk about the Great Recession, I'm going to talk about it in a particular way. I think most people or popular understanding of the recession refers just nebulously to the whole period of suboptimal conditions we've experienced really since late 2007 or 2008. Remember, about 6 years ago, around this time of year, Wall Street was melting down, the labor markets across the country were starting to unravel, and again, it feels like a long time has passed, but we're still dealing with the consequence. So when I refer to the Great Recession, I'm really going to be referring to sort of or more practically, sort of two parts. There was the actual recession period, which nationally went from the end of 2007 to mid-2009, and then ever since then we've been in recovery. And then the actual recovery period, which is from 2009 to the present. In North Carolina, you might date that a little differently. You could say the recession didn't start till earlier in 2008, but stretched into 2010, but that's the ballpark. The second thing I want to point out is when I talk about rural, I'm going to use more of the non-metropolitan definition like Becky identified, and so I'll really be referring mostly to the 54 non-metropolitan counties, except when I don't, and at that point, hopefully I will have flagged it on the slides, and so we can talk about that. And the third thing is I do have a number of graphs and slides. They aren't necessarily essential for our purposes today in the discussion, but I want folks to have at least something to look at, but also, too, after the fact, when you get the slides, I wanted folks to have a resource or a reference they could go back to in case it's helpful. So if you don't want to look at the bar charts, just feel free to imagine unicorns or puppies or rainbows or whatever you prefer over a bar chart of GDP. That's your call. So in terms of the key observations, where'd we go? That I wanted to leave you with, back that up. The first thing I want folks to realize is that the Great Recession really spared no community in North Carolina. Urban, rural, metro, non-metro, whatever it is, everybody was hurt, some places much more than others, but nobody got off scot-free. So we should remember that, at least from a labor market perspective. The second thing, I think, is that the recession has occurred alongside, or some of the forces associated with the recession have really led to an increased metropolitanization of the state's economy. Becky talked a little bit about that in terms of population, but all these other economic factors, economic output, labor force, employment, we are becoming an extremely metropolitan state, and that matters. I don't necessarily think that that's bad for non-metropolitan places. I think that also provides some opportunities and strengths. But we are changing, and we are a metropolitan economy, and I don't know if we can really think about North Carolina in simple binary terms of rural and urban anymore. The third point I would want to raise is that not all non-metropolitan communities have fared the same. Some places have fared somewhat better. Communities have different bundles of amenities, different locations, and so you really can't speak, I think, uniformly about the rural experience or the non-metro experience. And for example, when you look at a number of indicators, you'll see that those non-metropolitan counties that are slightly more urbanized or that are adjacent to metropolitan areas have had different experiences than those that haven't. And that could potentially be a source of strength going forward for those communities. And the last point I would would like to point out is that workforce challenges do exist in different ways in different types of communities. And in a variety of reasons we'll talk about, when we hear in the news people talking about the contraction of North Carolina's labor force, is it getting smaller? If you look at some of those numbers, that's a phenomenon being driven entirely by non-metro communities. So those are sort of my high-level overviews. So if you don't want to listen to the rest or look at the slides, you can go grab some coffee. But you have everything you need to know to be witty at a cocktail party tonight. So I've primed you for the reception. So moving on, I guess, the next thing. Okay, where'd we go? Oh, there we go. The first thing I just wanted to flag in terms of substantive is that when people talk about the recession, really, we're going to be spending a lot of time, I think, arguing about the causes of what happened over the past several years. But putting causality aside, for me, when I like to talk about what's happened with the labor market or the economy or the Great Recession, I look at it as a story that has sort of 4 chapters or 4 parts. We had the bursting of a housing bubble that gave way to a financial crisis, that gave way to a good old-fashioned demand-deficient recession, which then gave way to a jobless recovery. And today, my remarks are going to focus more on the last two parts of the story, the actual, and those are the two parts of the stories that deal the most with jobs and employment. But to put that in context, and this picks up a little bit about what Jim was saying, as you can see that North Carolina, since the late 90s has generally had a growing economy. This chart basically just shows year-over-year changes in state gross domestic product, and you'll see that the state's economy did grow, grow from the late 90s pretty steadily until the 2007 recession. Then it turned negative, and we saw declines. And then, of course, we've turned positive again. In many ways, from a GDP perspective, North Carolina's decline during the recession was not as severe as we saw nationally, but the recovery has not necessarily been as strong as we've seen nationally either. So we've had that dynamic. But the bottom line is, even with all the changes we've been through, we are now, or at least in 2013, the state's economy was still about 5.5% or 6% bigger than it was in 2007. So from a GDP perspective, we made back the ground that was lost, and we've also moved ahead in terms of our statewide economy is larger now than it was before the recession started. At the same time, if you want to break it out and look at something similar, you'll see that the geography of economic contraction has not necessarily been equally shared among metro and non-metro areas. If you look at some of the data there that looks at that, you'll see that during the downturn, both the GDP originating in the metro and non-metro areas of the state both fell. But during the recovery, you see that non-metro North Carolina continued to decline some after the recession. And so in many ways, the urban share of GDP, or urban GDP growth, has picked back up and has continued to grow, while non-metro areas have still not returned to their pre-recession level. So that provides some backdrop for what I'm going to get into about the labor market. But the other thing I think that you just keep in mind is that as a result of these changes in the recession, you'll see again that our state's economy has, in terms of output, has become much more metropolitan, and that from 2001, about 84% of GDP originated in metro areas, and that's now up to about 86%. And you'll see that the non-metro share is down to 13.3%. So you need to keep that in mind. So again, economic activity output become increasingly concentrated in the state's growing metropolitan areas. So we'll move ahead there. So the other thing I think we should keep in mind is, or the other point I want to make, if the GDP contraction and change was not as pronounced in North Carolina as it was nationally, as Jim pointed out, the job side of the equation was very pronounced here. And when the Great Recession took hold, basically what we wound up seeing in North Carolina is a widespread recession that affected every major industry in the state, every major geographic region. It was very widespread. And what I show here on this chart is the major industry groups in North Carolina and the contractions that occurred between 2007 and 2010. So from when the recession started to the worst moment in time before the recovery kicked in. And so you'll see during that period, metro and non-metro areas both had negative job growth in a variety of key industries. You saw that really the most affected industries, as Jim referred to, were manufacturing and construction. And of course, the local consequences of these changes are going to vary a lot depending on the individual mix of the industry and the place in question. So if you have a very large manufacturing sector in your region, you would experience something differently than a community that had less of that presence. But the point was, we've been through with the recession. It was not something that just affected a few industries. It was across the board, and it affected jobs everywhere, every place, every industry. So let's see, can we move forward there? Oh, there we go. And the other thing that happened was that once we came out of the worst part of the period, we lost all those jobs, but then we also had a very pronounced, very slow recovery. So what this chart basically does is it shows the amount of time it took for the state to replace all the jobs that had been lost during 3 different recessions. The black line is the most recent one. And you'll see that it was only last month, September of 2014, that North Carolina got back to the same number of payroll jobs that it had at the end of 2007. That was an 81-month period, and that just gets back got the state back to where it was. As Jim pointed out, there were all these other jobs we should have been creating in the period that we haven't. So even if we say we're back to zero, I don't know if that's exactly something to be proud of. Yay, look, we're back to zero. But we also realize that we still have a job shortfall of, depending on the estimate, of about 400,000 to 450,000 positions. So again, we just got back to where we were, and we haven't really taken care of the progress we should have made and didn't. So that's something else to keep in mind. Also, I think if you look at the chart, the bluer line is the 2001 recession, which when I first started doing this work, the 2001 recession was going, everyone was like, oh, this is so horrible, this is terrible, we've never seen anything like it. And then 2007 came along, and I think many people would be willing to trade back to the glory days of 2001. But also, if you took the black line and more or less hooked it around, if you wanted to put this in temporal, those two lines almost completely blur into each other. So by the time the blue line gets back over the 0 mark, you have a little more growth for several months, but then you get back, but then the floor falls out again. So this is when I talk about, people say, are we on our way to a lost decade of job growth in North Carolina? We've already had one. We've turned the corner, and we're well on our way to decade number 2. Which is something I think people don't fully realize, because we still have this image of North Carolina as being the gangbusters, high growth, high job growth state of the late 1990s, but we're getting a pretty far away from when that happened. So keep that in mind as well. And there we go. The bottom line, though, I think, is if you look at some of the numbers, because the recovery has been so slow, we still have a way to go in both metro and non-metro communities at replacing a lot of the jobs that were lost. We're still down in many key industries, and also some of the industries that have grown, as Jim alluded to, are those that maybe have a very different wage mix than we saw in the past. We may very well have been, depending on your community, eliminating better paying jobs and have brought more lower paying jobs in, and that creates problems as well. So with that said, that's sort of the high-level overview of sort of GDP and what's happened on the job front. And again, this is all payroll jobs, so these are positions on company payrolls. When you add all of that up, you wind up in this situation where North Carolina has experienced, due to the recession, what I would argue is, very high, arguably mass joblessness, mass long-term unemployment has become a pronounced feature of not just the North Carolina, but the American labor market. And that's, I think, a development that policymakers in Washington and Raleigh have refused to admit has happened, and we're still working on this assumption of it's just going to bounce back any day now. But it really hasn't. So if you look at what this chart basically shows is unemployment rates, and comparing them in North Carolina, so the time it took to return to the pre-recession unemployment rate in 4 different business cycles. The black line up top is the most recent one, and then you see the other recessions going back to the early 80s there. But you'll see that unemployment rate went much higher in North Carolina than it did in any of those other previous recessions. It stayed higher longer, and even though we're coming down, like Jim referenced, we still have a way to go to get back to where we were. So this feature, this is, I think, an important new development in our state, and it matters as well because of the fact that you can't just tell for a lot of, how do I want to put that? For most households, for most families, their participation in the economy, for them the labor market is the economy. That's the mechanism through which they contribute their talents to the economy. That is the mechanism through which they earn a living to support themselves. And so when the labor markets don't work well or are underperforming for long periods of time, that translates into real hardship, and we'll come back to that in a second. To give you a little more perspective, this map, I don't know if the shading is that good, but to show how severe conditions were, this shows February 2010 county unemployment rates. And basically everything in the purple or dark blue was an unemployment rate of at least 10%. So if you look at that map, basically at the worst moment in the recession, virtually all of the state had unemployment rates at or above 10%. So that just shows you sort of the geographic magnitude of what happened. Now, conditions have improved over the past several years. It has been a very slow recovery that has sort of mirrored the national trends, keeping with what Jim referenced. And you'll see, though, that even though we've had a lot of improvement, conditions in many communities, unemployment rates still remain elevated across a great deal of the state. And that's something that we can't we can't ignore. So, for example, in August, 63 counties in North Carolina had unemployment rates greater than or equal to 7%. Now, is that better than 10%, 11%, 12%? Yes. But I still don't think 7% is anything to throw a party about, because it represents real suffering. And also, if you looked at some of the slides that Jim shared earlier, go back to like the late 90s, early 2000s, the state routinely had unemployment rates of under 4%. And even some of these metro areas like Durham, Chapel Hill, even at that time, they had unemployment rates that were probably in the low 3s. So just to give you a sense of how radically things have changed. So we've made progress, but we still have a long way to go to be back to healthy or normal. There we go. And as I'll point out too, one of the issues with this change that we've seen during the Great Recession is the way the labor force has moved. Is that we've seen an increasing, again, the metro labor force has become a labor force in North Carolina, and you could extend this to unemployment as well, has become much more concentrated in metro areas. Particularly, you've seen a shift really from non-metro area up with the gain going to some of the largest metro areas in the state, which basically means by large metro we're talking about Charlotte and all of those communities in that area. Again, the gains that are occurring there may provide other opportunities for folks in the counties that are nearby and adjacent. But again, rural North Carolina or non-metro North Carolina accounts for a smaller and smaller share of the state's labor force, and that's something else to keep in mind. Now, one of the things I pointed out earlier, and this is something I'd like to tease out more in the future, but for our purposes today is, as I said, one of my takeaways is that not all rural communities are equal, have experienced the recession equally. And what this chart does, essentially, is it tries to take all the counties in the state and group them in a different way based on population and their location next to, or their proximity to a metro area. So the three bars that are highlighted in gold, that's metropolitan North Carolina. All the other bars are rural North Carolina. And this shows basically the increase in unemployment that occurred at the worst part of the recession. And you'll see that everybody experienced massive increases in unemployment in percentage term during that period. You would see something similar if you looked at the decline in employment and looked at a variety of different factors. But what you start to see here, I think, in this chart, is that different communities experience things differently. With those communities that had rural or non-metro places that were slightly more urbanized, some of those micropolitan type of areas, if you're familiar with those terms. If not, I won't get into that. Or that are adjacent to metropolitan areas, those counties experienced somewhat better developments. And so there's a question, I think, of instead of thinking of rural in a very general way, is there sort of a more nuanced position we can take in some of our economic development and workforce development, think a little more regionally, and realize that being near a metro area is a source of strength, being in a micropolitan area, or that there's potential strength in these smaller, these smaller communities that are more urbanized within our rural areas. So that's something I think to think about, because some of the data that I played with, and not sharing all of it today, kind of suggests that. Same way, you'll see that this is sort of flipping around and looking at the recovery. You'll see that all areas of the states have seen a decrease in the number of unemployed persons, but you see some of the fluctuation in county types, particularly in the non-metro areas, depending, again, with some factors like the degree of urbanization and their proximity to metro areas. So with that said, the last point I want to bring up in the last couple of minutes is, I think, as Jim pointed out to you, the unemployment rate is a useful but limited measure of what's going on in the labor market. It's one indicator, and relying solely on that is no different than trying to drive a car with only one gauge on your dashboard. You might have a sense of where you're going, but you don't really know the big picture. But one of the bigger concerns, and I think Jim referenced this too, was this idea that in North Carolina, we're seeing major changes in the size of our labor force, even though our population's growing. And if you look at it, what's called our labor force participation rate, the share of the population that basically could be available for work in the civilian economy, and is actually engaged in the civilian economy, has been falling. And it's fallen rapidly since during this Great Recession. As you see on this map, we're now at the lowest level recorded since 1976. So again, so our labor force participation rate in the state has really been coming down. There are a variety of factors for that. Demographics can play a role. Economic factors can play a role. There's a debate about what's causing this to happen. But I would say with the magnitude of the change and how quickly it's occurred, that there's more than just simple demographics at work in North Carolina, because again, it's not like suddenly we woke up one day and everybody got old all of a sudden or something like that. I mean, we know these processes. Aging's a gradual process. I'm sure Becky could talk all about the demographic piece and how that works out as a concept, but there's more going on there. So this is something we need to keep in mind, because of the fact that as people leave the labor force, that creates a variety of issues. The other point I wanted to lift up is that if you try to break it out and look at where you've seen labor force change, during the overall business cycle of 2007 through 13, you're continuing to see gains in the metro areas, but every kind of non-metro community has seen decrease. And overall, we're in this dynamic where the labor force has grown in metro areas, but it's being offset to some degree by contraction in non-metro areas, though again, you see some of the declines you're seeing are not as pronounced in those communities that are closer to metro areas or that are more urbanized themselves. So that's something else to keep in mind. And the last, I guess, point I'd like to make, if we can move, two other points. One is, if you see some of this issue about labor force participation and size matters, particularly in rural North Carolina, because the fact that non-metro North Carolina does have a much older workforce structure. So for example, in 2014, roughly 48% of the non-metropolitan workforce was considered to be a prime age worker between 25 and 54. In the metro areas, it was closer to 52%. So again, older workers bring a lot of skills, they bring a lot of values, but they also have some different needs from a workforce perspective, and you need to keep that in mind as well. And the last thing I'll point out, and there's a lot of data here, is that we often talk about the labor market. We often talk about economics in terms of numbers and tables and charts and graphs, and I've shown you numbers and tables and charts and graphs. But remember, all of this comes back to actual people, their families, their households, and the labor market does not treat everyone equally. We know that traditionally some groups, some populations are affected more negatively by trends than others, and you need to pay attention to that based on your community's mix of demographics. So some population groups that may have experienced a great deal of hardship during the recession may be more concentrated in some rural places, and you need to pay attention to that. So, for example, in this chart, I just pick up and show, and you can look at this when you get the slides, some of the changes, and you'll see that on factors like unemployment rate or declining labor force participation rate, you see very clear patterns. For example, by race, African Americans have experienced this recession has hurt everyone, but African American workers have experienced it much more severely than non-Hispanic whites have, for example. Same way, when you look at the educational breakdown, you'll see that all educational groups have struggled during the recession and have been hurt in terms of increased unemployment and other negative consequences. But again, you'll see more of an impact on those who have maybe lesser degrees or less formal education. So again, depending on your community mix and your community demographics, this has to matter. And then the last thing I think we just want to keep in mind is that one of the things we've seen throughout this period during the recession is that we have lost, I would say in North Carolina, a great deal of the progress we had made in previous decades around such issues as poverty reduction. And as you see here, during this recession, you've seen an increase not just in poverty, which are the bottom two bars added together, but you've also seen an increase in the share of families living in deep poverty, and you've also continued to see the issues of people in sort of that working poverty category, which is the lighter blue bar and the 100 to 200% of poverty. So again, we're seeing more economic hardships, and again, even with work, particularly with the new mix of jobs we're talking about and Jim alluded to, these questions of low-wage work and the adequacy of work also are becoming more and more pronounced and coming back on the stage, and we need to think about how that unfolds during the recession. So I think I said my piece very quickly. Hopefully I sort of drilled down a little bit and gave you some perspective of what's happened. And again, just there are a few lessons there that I want people to keep in mind about the fact that the Great Recession was widespread in terms of its labor market impact, that it has resulted or contributed to the metropolitanization of the state. Let's see, go there. Not all non-metro communities have fared the same, and I think there are issues and opportunities we could look at with those communities that are a little more urbanized or adjacent to metro areas in terms of economic development and workforce strategies. And that even with all these changes, we still have a number of issues around workforce challenges, around issues of economic hardship that are within our state that have become more pronounced and aren't going away anytime soon, and we need to be mindful of those. So with that sort of whirlwind tour of the Great Recession, I will sit down and get us over to the panel, and I just appreciate your time and your willingness to listen to me opine for a few minutes. So thank you very much.